Hello, I'm Tom with a list of interesting things. I wanted to make a video today on a somewhat somber and unhappy topic. Effective a little after midnight on October the 2nd, Donald Trump, President of the United States, and First Lady Melania Trump were confirmed to have contracted COVID-19. Now, this certainly qualifies for the list of interesting political things, but we're not going to call it that because this topic we're going to discuss requires a little bit more reverence. A number of people, myself included, have taken this as an opportunity to wonder what exactly might happen if the worst befalls President Trump. The president is not a young man, nor is he the healthiest human being on planet Earth, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that he could be moderately or seriously ill for 2 weeks or more. And it's unlikely, but possible, that this proves fatal. So today, we're going to go over the protocols for what happens if the president is seriously incapacitated, as well as what happens if a candidate is incapacitated this late in the campaign. The former applies only to Donald Trump, but the latter may be relevant to both candidates. Let's all keep in mind that just a few days ago, Joe Biden spent 90 minutes across from the president while the president was already sick. So there's a meaningful, but small chance that the former vice president is sick too. Before we dive in, I'd like to remind everyone that these are very serious topics and are not to be taken lightly. There won't be any quips or jests in this video, and I hope that everyone watching, regardless of political affiliation, takes this as seriously as I do. So, the president is sick. There is currently no reason to believe that he's seriously ill, but for the sake of discussion, let's assume that he is. Let's say that over the next week or so, he were to develop, say, pneumonia. This is a fairly common response in elderly individuals who contract the disease, and in serious cases, it can lead to a patient being confined to a ventilator or even dying. So let's start with the question that's easiest to answer. What happens if the president dies? This is pretty straightforward. The presidential line of succession is very well understood, and it even has its own ABC show. The line goes President, Vice President, Speaker of the House, President pro tempore of the Senate, and then it goes through the cabinet members in the order on screen. This has the rather interesting side effect of meaning that if both President Trump and Vice President Pence were to fall ill, then the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would become acting president. A somewhat more complicated question to ask is what happens if the president is too sick to perform his duties, but remains alive? Well, this is exactly why we have vice presidents. If the president is incapacitated due to disease, then the 25th Amendment will undoubtedly be invoked. The 25th Amendment clarifies some gray areas in the presidential line of succession. The following are the 4 sections of the amendment. Number 1. In the case of removal of the president from office, or of death or of resignation, the vice president shall become president. This makes sense. The president leaves office and the vice president succeeds them. Section 2. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority of both houses of Congress. This makes sense too. You don't want a president without a vice president in case something bad happens to the president. On to the first of 2 important parts. Section 3. Whenever the president transmits to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives a written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. This allows the president to voluntarily and temporarily abdicate his power, ceding it to the vice president until such time as he is well again. This has happened a number of times in U.S. history, usually when the president has to undergo medical procedures, and this is by far the most likely scenario to arise if the president falls seriously ill. He can sign power over to Pence, who becomes acting president, and then reclaim the office once he's better. But what if the president becomes so ill that he's unable to remain conscious? Well, that's when Section 4 is enacted. There's a lot of fluff in this one, but I'll summarize. The section gives the vice president, in conjunction with a majority of the cabinet members, the ability to remove the president's power without his consent. Now, this has never been enacted, but would be in moments of extreme illness, in moments of attacks, or, more ominously, if the vice president determines the president to be mentally unfit for office. This has never happened, but it has been considered a number of times. For example, in 1981, when President Reagan was shot at a speaking event in Washington, D.C., the president immediately went in for surgery. Then Vice President Bush intended to invoke Section 4, but he was in Texas at the time, and by the time he returned to D.C., Reagan had regained consciousness, and so they invoked Section 3 instead. In another more modern example, in 2017, there were reports of serious conversations going on about relieving President Trump of duty following the firing of James Comey, the FBI director who was investigating him at the time, though this never got past the initial discussion. So, that's how presidential succession works, but what about the candidates? Well, strap in, because it's about to get interesting. If the worst happens to either candidate between now and when the Electoral College meets in December, then things get a little complicated. For the sake of discussion, let's assume that in the 2020 presidential race, Joe Biden dies. The natural assumption will be that the vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, advances and then takes Biden's spot. But that's not really how it works. If a vacancy appears during the race, the VP doesn't move up, but rather the state parties, and through them, the national parties, have the authority to delegate a new candidate in their place. In this case, however, it would be too late. Most states have already, by now, begun printing ballots, and millions of absentee and mail-in ballots have already been sent out. Logistically, it just can't be done. So Election Day will come and go, and the deceased candidate's name will remain on the ballot. Let's say that Biden wins. If he does, the decision will then go to the Electoral College. You may recall from our video on the Electoral College that federally, electors are not bound to vote for the candidate that they're pledged to. However, some states have passed laws requiring electors to vote for the candidate to whom they are pledged. These laws were deemed constitutional by the Supreme Court case Chiafalo v. Washington and the related case, the Colorado Department of State v. Baca. In these cases, states were given the affirmative authority to prevent so-called faithless electors from voting against their pledged candidates, at least not without incurring hefty fines and risking the chance that their votes could be invalidated. Now, depending on the word of each of these state laws, electors may be bound to vote for Biden in spite of the fact that he is then deceased. And here things start to get a little murky. These sections of constitutional law are largely untested. It's possible that some of the electors from states that don't have laws restricting them will vote faithlessly and choose another presidential candidate. Perhaps Bernie Sanders, another former presidential hopeful. But if some electors vote faithlessly and some of them don't, then you're left with a really interesting situation in the middle of December where Donald Trump has some votes, Joe Biden has some votes, and Bernie Sanders has some votes, but none of them has a majority. If no candidate has a majority in the Electoral College, then both the president-elect and vice president-elect are determined by the incoming Congress. This is called a contingent election, and these have been tested. You have the esteemed Mr. Aaron Burr to thank for the following precedent. If a contingent election is triggered, then the House of Representatives chooses the president, and the Senate chooses the vice president. Now, this can have the interesting and unusual outcome of both of the candidates being selected by two different parties. If the houses of Congress are controlled by two different parties, in the scenario where Biden is deceased, you could reasonably end up with President Elizabeth Warren or President Bernie Sanders serving alongside Vice President Mike Pence or Vice President Donald Trump. Now, this may be the most likely scenario if one of the candidates dies. It may just trigger a contingent election, which will take place in early January just after the new Congress takes session. However, this isn't the only scenario. Another plausible alternative is that all of the electors that are pledged to vote for Biden agree collectively to vote for another candidate as one. They are then fined by their respective states who attempt to invalidate their ballots according to their laws. Then all of the electors sue their respective states as one, and the case climbs the ladder all the way up to the Supreme Court, maybe under the heading of Friends of Bernie Sanders v. North Carolina et al. It would then be up to the Supreme Court to decide whether to uphold the precedent in Chiafalo v. Washington or to overturn it. And before you con law scholars say there's no way they'll overturn precedent so recent, you may be right, but there's a big difference between allowing a state to invalidate one electoral vote and allowing a state to invalidate all of them. But like I said, These are completely untested waters, and hopefully we won't have to see them tested this year. 2020 has been strange enough without talk of another constitutional crisis. I hope that the President and the First Lady make a swift and safe recovery, just as I do for every person affected by COVID. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date on all the most interesting things. Until then, be interesting. See you next time.